Hey guys, so I want to make a video about Book of Mormon geography and church leader statements. Sometimes we use church leader statements to prove our theories. And I'm going to pick on the Heartlanders here because they do this a lot. Now, just to clarify, people who support a Mesoamerican model can do this too. People who support a Peru model can do this too. And also, just to clarify, when I pick on the Heartlander group here, it's mostly the die-hard core people who use these things. I realize that there's lots of people who might support a Heartland model who aren't as into it as others and just kind of like the surrounding ideas around it. At the same time, I'm picking more on the Heartland model, not necessarily the Great Lakes model or North American model. I do think there's some merit to some of these models up in North America, but I'm picking more on the approach where you use church history statements to support your geography, where you hyper focus on a few statements and neglect all the other statements. So we're going to go over a lot of church history statements here today. I've got a PowerPoint prepped, and we're just going to go through a ton and do this really quick. So many people leave comments in my geography videos about Joseph Smith said this, about this, and therefore it happened in the Heartland model. But I've collected tons and tons of quotes over the years just to show people, well, Joseph Smith said this, but he also said this. So we're going to go over these. By the way, I'm here in Montana. I'm in a hotel right now. We are visiting the Crow Reservation every day here, and we're filming things for my full-time job on the other YouTube channel called the Ancient America Foundation. And we're just getting the Native American perspective on a lot of historical issues here. So that's why the background looks different today. Anyways, so we got Joseph Smith, and a lot of people will say he said this and this about where the Book of Mormon happened. And so one common quote that they bring up, Heartlanders bring up, is this one where Joseph Smith wrote a letter to his wife as they were traveling, I think on Zion's camp. And Joseph wrote, "The whole of our journey, in the midst of so large a company of social, honest, and sincere men, wandering over the plains of the Nephites, recounting occasionally the history of the Book of Mormon, roving over the mounds of that once beloved people of the Lord, picking up their skulls and their bones as proof of its divine authenticity." Now, this is a good quote, but if we just focus on this quote, then we could say this is evidence for the Heartland model. But he made other quotes. So, for example, later, Joseph wrote a letter to John Bernheisel. I don't know how to pronounce that last name. John had given Joseph Smith a popular book that was going around about new ruins being discovered in Mesoamerica. And he had given this to Joseph Smith to show him how these new civilizations were being discovered. And if you remember in my last video, the witnesses to the Book of Mormon were hesitant to signing their name to the witness statement because even though they believed in the angel and the plates, they were worried people would make fun of them because there was no evidence of massive civilizations around them. Apparently, the mounds around them weren't big enough evidence of major cities and civilizations. So this book started coming out, and a lot of people gravitated towards this book in the church. Joseph Smith got this book, and then he wrote back to John and said, "I received your kind present by the hand of Elder Wilford Woodruff, and feel myself under many obligations for this mark of your esteem and friendship, which to me is the more interesting, as it unfolds and develops many themes that are of great importance to this." And then he says, "and corresponds with and supports the testimony of the Book of Mormon. I have read the volumes with the greatest interest and pleasure, and must say that of all the histories that have been written pertaining to the antiquities of this country, it is the most correct, luminous, and comprehensive." So he's seen this book. Joseph Smith's seen this book. He's sending this letter. He signs it with his name. I mean, a lot of times he's using scribes, but he puts his name on this. As he dictates, he has a scribe who will write these things down. That happens with both letters, that to his wife Emma about the plains of the Nephites, and to this one. But he signs his name on it. He says it corresponds with and supports the testimony of the Book of Mormon. And I'll also point out that he later says, to the antiquities of this country. Sometimes Heartlanders will say this country is only about the United States, when really, a lot of times when they say this country, they are talking about the entire Americas, the entire New World, the entire Western Hemisphere. They were living in a time where the Americas was a whole, and it was this major promised land. We'll get into promised land later in this video. Anyways, he's talking about Mesoamerican ruins, and he calls it this country. So here we have Joseph Smith making statements for Mesoamerica. And then later, this book gets spread around the LDS community, and then the church's official newspaper, the Times and Seasons, publishes several articles about this book. And Joseph Smith was the editor of this newspaper, so he reviewed it. Joseph Smith had copies of these newspapers in his library, so he never took these down. Sometimes Heartlanders will say that Joseph didn't know about these things, didn't write these letters. There's some conspiracy about someone writing it for him. But he never took any of these down. He never retracted any of this. And it got huge. It got major. It got published in their newspaper. I can't remember, almost a dozen times, nine to dozen times or something like that. Anyways, and they've done word analysis of these articles and have found evidence that it looks like it could be Joseph Smith who's writing or dictating this. It matches his style. Anyways, he's the editor. And in this article, it says, Stevens and Catherwood's researches. So this book was by Stephen and Catherwood's. Their researches in Central America abundantly testify of this theme of the Book of Mormon. The stupendous ruins, the elegant sculpture, and the magnificence of the ruins of Guatemala and other cities corroborate this statement and show that a great and mighty people, men of great minds, clear intellect, bright genius, and comprehensive designs, inhabited this continent. Their ruins speak of their greatness. The Book of Mormon unfolds their history. So this was a major thing happening back then. A lot of times Heartlanders will bring up Oliver Cowdery and say that he said the Book of Mormon happened in Hill Cumorah. Therefore, the Book of Mormon happened in the Heartland, because he wrote some letters about Hill Cumorah. In fact, the idea of Hill Cumorah seems to have come from Oliver and W.W. Phelps. Joseph Smith never mentioned the Hill Cumorah until once later in his life, in kind of a general way. Whether or not it's the real Hill Cumorah, I don't think it is, but that's an entire video of itself. But whether or not it is, you can't pick up one end of the stick without picking up the other. Because Oliver Cowdery, when he went on his mission to the Lamanites, just right after the publication of the Book of Mormon, he was going on this mission and he was talking to newspapers. And he told the newspaper reported that according to the narrative given by one of these disciples, Oliver Cowdery, according to the narrative of the Book of Mormon, they landed on the coast of Chile 600 years before the coming of Christ. So Oliver was telling people that Lehi landed in Chile. This is where you start to get some of the ideas that people who support a Peru model will focus on. That Joseph Smith said that Lehi landed in Chile. And maybe Joseph Smith mentioned this stuff to Oliver Cowdery as he was looking at a bigger map or something. But, and then later, you even, in some editions of the Book of Mormon, it even mentions, there's footnotes about Lehi landing in Chile. And so people have gravitated towards that for their model, usually a South American model. And then here we have Brigham Young. Now, if Joseph Smith thought it only happened in the Heartland, then you'd think he'd make this clear to every other apostle. But every other apostle has statements all over the place. You think he would have made it clear to Brigham Young as well. But Brigham Young says stuff like this. Later, he says, when talking about the expansion of the church, nor do I expect we shall stop at Arizona, but I look forward to the time when the settlements of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints will extend right through the city of Old Mexico, and from thence on through Central America to the land where the Nephites flourished in the golden era of their history. So he's talking about the Nephites through Central America, through Old Mexico. And this brings up another problem that Heartlanders start to walk on this edge of this cliff, because then they can't use this, right? So then you sometimes see Heartlanders playing this dangerous game of, well, everything Joseph Smith said before this time is true and everything after is not true. Almost getting to the idea that, once Brigham Young became prophet, the church started to go astray. And that's a dangerous idea as well. I've seen comments like that. Again, I'm not talking about Heartlanders who just like the idea of it. These are core diehard ones. Howard W. Hunter is interesting. So now we're getting in a bit to modern prophets, because a lot of Latter-day Heartlanders will say Joseph Smith said this, therefore it's true. But what about all these modern prophets who are now making statements? Are they not following Joseph Smith? I think they're just enjoying these ideas and sharing their personal thoughts about it. So Howard W. Hunter, he was an enthusiast for Book of Mormon geography. He was a prophet, and he once said in the Deseret News, in the heart of the Mayan area of Mesoamerica, which has such great significance in the Book of Mormon history. And if you go to the Church History Museum and look at his exhibit, he's got props that they've put up of these Mesoamerican things, this Maya Stele Izapa 5, which at that time they thought portrayed the tree of life. It does portray a tree of life that was sacred to Maya, so it is related to Book of Mormon geography, but not probably the exact dream that Lehi saw. And here he is traveling to see some ruins in Central America, because he just loved this stuff, right? This is his personal opinion. President Russell Nelson, when he was prophet, he was going on this tour, and the Deseret News reported that in Mexico, I think, it said that as President Nelson arrived in the land of the eternal spring, President Nelson said his thoughts were with the ancient civilizations whose ruins still define this nation. And he said the lands of Central America and South America are studded with ruins, remnants. He says remnants, remember that, of ancient civilization. He said, one wonders what life must have been like among those people. Then he clarifies, add to the message on the title page of the Book of Mormon that it is written to the Lamanites, who are a remnant of the house of Israel. Again, he's using remnant here, making a connection between the ruins and the Lamanites. We not only learn about those ancient inhabitants, but we learn that the Lord cares for his children in this hemisphere, both in ancient times and in modern times. So here we have President Nelson kind of supporting a Mesoamerican model. But again, we can't hyper-focus on this, because later he reports in Brazil to the missionaries to ask investigators if they know about the mission of Jesus Christ to the people of South America. So now he's making a statement for South America. I share these just to show that you can't just support a Heartland model when there's statements like this everywhere. President Gordon B. Hinckley talking about ruins in Guatemala. Even though it has now been over 2 years since the dedication of the Guatemala City Temple, I vividly recall the great and moving experience it was to participate in those sacred services. Those familiar with the people estimated that more than 75% of those who were there were descendants of Father Lehi. So he's making a bold statement about the people in Guatemala being descendants of Father Lehi. Now let's get into the Promised Land. And we're going to go through this quick, but a big thing about the Heartland model is that it's true because it's talking about the promised land, and only the United States can be the promised land. The Heartland model, I think, is not just a geography model here, because the geography doesn't make sense. They have no West Sea. The Heartland model's supposed West Sea at the Great Lakes is actually north of their Zarahemla. So the geography doesn't make sense. Their Hill Cumorah and their narrow neck of land, the Hill Cumorah is east of their narrow neck of land instead of north, like the Book of Mormon says. So lots of problems there, but it doesn't matter because for the Heartland model, it's more of this patriotic, almost nationalistic American exceptionalism backing idea behind it. And that's that the United States is this promised land. A lot of times you'll see him use L. Tom Perry's quote here, which says that the United States is the promised land foretold in the Book of Mormon. So they'll latch onto this, not realizing that L. Tom Perry made other statements. He once said that archaeologists have confirmed the existence of a great pre-Aztec civilization on the American continent. The Book of Mormon is a record of this civilization. So he's saying pre-Aztec. That's Maya, that's Olmec, that's Mesoamerica. He's saying that this is a record of this civilization. So you can't pick up one end of the stick without picking up the other here. So how can we make sense of the United States being the only promised land according to L. Tom Perry? Well, it could be the promised land, but there could be multiple promised lands. And it seems like that's what he's saying because he had this bigger view of the Book of Mormon. So I like to bring in these quotes by other prophets here. So this is by Ezra Taft Benson. I always just include this anytime someone leaves a comment about the promised land. He said, "To the Latter-day Saints, the promised land of Zion includes all of North and South America." All of North and South America. Now, sometimes you'll see Heartland leaders saying, oh, he's talking about the northern states and the southern states of the United States. That's not the case. It's obviously not, but just to help show that that's not the case, you also have this other quote by Ezra Taft Benson, where he says, "In the last few weeks, I have had the glorious privilege of visiting 11 of our Latin American countries. Latin American countries. I have found that they were very happy to learn that to the Latter-day Saints, the promised land, the land of Zion, includes all of North and South America." So the promised land is the entire Americas. You have this statement by the official church under the promised land, lands that the Lord promises as an inheritance to his faithful followers and often also to their descendants. There are many promised lands. Often in the Book of Mormon, the promised land spoken of is the Americas. We have this quote by Spencer W. Kimball at the Sao Paulo, Brazil temple dedication. "We thank thee that thou didst bring Father Lehi and his family to this land of promise, and thou didst establish thy people, the Nephites and the Lamanites, in their Book of Mormon." So the promised land is the entire America as it extends south to Brazil. This is a good quote by Jeffrey R. Holland in his talk called The Promised Land. And he makes the point that the borders we have today are just borders. They don't mean anything. So he says, temporarily, we call it America. It has not always looked the same geographically, nor has it always been governed the same politically. But that all seems appropriate since the meaning of America, in its most theological sense, is something more than borders and boundaries, something above nativism and nationalism. It is an ideal, a thing of the spirit. And I like that, especially considering this is a talk about the promised land. It's not about borders. The promised land doesn't end at the Mexican border, right? Now, just really quick, while we're talking about the promised land, a lot of times Heartlanders were bringing the idea of liberty and kings, and only the United States had no kings and has liberty, and all these other countries have none of that. But that's not how prophets have thought. So this quote by Spencer W. Kimball, after Kimball was quoting the scriptures about the land of liberty, he says, "It tells of the ancestors of those whose spectacular monuments are now observed in South America, South and Central America, and in the Mexican jungles. So he's talking about liberty, but then he's including these countries in South and Central America. Another point about no kings is David O. McKay once said, "Nations have risen and nations have perished in the Americas, a land on which it is declared no kings shall ever hold sway. To each and all of these nations, the land was a blessed land, and today is even more glorious than ever. America, and this includes Canada and the Southern Republics, was a choice land when the Jaredites left, and the land of Shinar approximately 4,000 years ago." So I'm showing these just to show their opinions, that this idea of no kings and liberty only in the United States is not what prophets have thought. And this shows it. J. Reuben Clark, "And this shall be a land of liberty unto the Gentiles. And there shall be no kings upon the land who shall raise up unto the Gentiles. The unhappy, short-lived experiences of the Dom Pedros in Brazil and of Maximilian in Mexico seem the exceptions that prove the rule the Spirit of the Lord was leading." So he's saying some of these South American countries tried to have kings and succeeded for temporarily, but then they were overthrown. And that actually shows that the Book of Mormon is true, because there were no kings being allowed here. And sometimes we forget that even the United States temporarily had a king from England. So you got to keep these things in mind. We can't just assume that the United States is the only land of liberty. Now, how do we make sense of all this? Well, there's a couple ways to make sense of this. The church once had a newsroom article called "Approaching Latter-day Saint Doctrine." How do we determine doctrine? In a lot of my studies about answering hard questions or Book of Mormon geography, a lot of times this just comes down to learning for yourself what it means to figure out doctrine. And I've come to find out that there's really only a dozen core doctrines that we believe in. Then we've got policies and procedures, and then we got esoteric ideas or theories around these. But the core doctrine, that doesn't change. But this article by the church points this out. It later says, "Not every statement made by a church leader, past or present, necessarily constitutes doctrine." So that's a mistake some people make with Joseph Smith and others, as they cherry pick his statements and say they're doctrine. "A single statement made by a single leader on a single occasion often represents a personal, though well-considered opinion, but is not meant to be officially binding for the whole church." So even Joseph Smith, if he makes a single statement here and there that's not considered doctrine, the first presidency and the Quorum of the 12 have to establish it as doctrine. One of the best ways to determine doctrine is it repeated over and over in the Old Testament, in the New Testament, in the Book of Mormon, in the Doctrine and Covenants, in the Pearl of Great Price. Is it repeated over and over with our leaders today? That's how you know Jesus Christ is the focus of our faith. You even have a quote by Joseph Smith where he says that Jesus Christ is our focus and everything else are appendages to this. Anyways, that's how we determine doctrine. And this really makes things clear when it comes to church history statements. The article later says, "Isolated statements are often taken out of context, leaving their original meaning distorted." Another way for determining doctrine, especially when it comes to Book of Mormon geography, is the church has several official essays, statements about big topics like this: polygamy, racism. They also have an essay about Book of Mormon geography. This is an essay that the first presidency put out that members of the Quorum of 12 Apostles have asked us to, I think Elder Ballard said, know them like the back of your hand. And in this one, it says, the church's only position when it comes to Book of Mormon geography is that the events the Book of Mormon describes took place in the ancient Americas. So that's the only position. That's the only doctrine here. And it even goes into Joseph Smith, acknowledging that he made statements all over the place. The prophet Joseph Smith himself accepted what he felt was evidence of Book of Mormon civilizations in both North and Central America. And so even though Joseph Smith made these statements, they're not enough to help us figure out where it happened. And this essay kind of is suggesting that even though he's made these statements, our only official belief is that it happened somewhere in the Americas. His statements aren't enough to weigh the balances back and forth. And then it goes into the first presidency's thought about Book of Mormon geography. However, the first presidency and quorum of the 12 apostles urges leaders and members not to advocate those personal theories in any setting or manner that would imply either prophetic or church support for those theories. So we can't imply prophetic or church support. We can't say that our theory is doctrine. We can't say that Joseph Smith said this and therefore it's true. And that can lead to some problems that we'll get into later. If you get too much into Book of Mormon geography, you might actually start thinking that other people might be in apostasy. I've been accused of being apostasy for not following Joseph Smith because his statement says this and this and this. Now, just to clarify, the church's geography essay does say that it's okay to look at Book of Mormon geography and study it out. It later says individuals may have their own opinions regarding Book of Mormon geography and other such matters about which the Lord has not spoken. So they're fine with this. They just don't want us proclaiming these as doctrine, especially in a church setting and stuff like that. And this is an example. This is a comment of an organization I worked for where someone claimed that it was part of the Latter-day apostasy. So you start to get on this dangerous edge of this cliff when you start to feel like your Book of Mormon theory is doctrine. And I see this a lot with Heartlanders, unfortunately, because I think their leaders are kind of promoting this, that these statements are that Joseph Smith couldn't have been wrong, right? Believe Joseph Smith, even though, you start getting confliction because Joseph Smith said this and this. You can't pick up one end of the stick without picking up the other end of the stick. So, and it also starts to get dangerous because you start to think other people are wrong, but then you start seeing the church publishing things like this. And then the dangerous thing is then you might start wondering, is the church in apostasy for supporting some of these ideas or publishing some of these things? And I've seen Heartland leaders suggest that different departments of the church are in apostasy. And that's a very dangerous game to avoid here. Now, so this is a map of the entire Americas. That's because in the early church, every leader thought the Book of Mormon happened all over the Americas. The whole Americas where the Book of Mormon lands. That's why you have statements from Joseph Smith in the North and Central America. So it's kind of futile to use church history statements to support your theory unless you have a hemispheric model. But basically, after the saints have had time to study it out, after persecutions ended, after archaeology actually became a thing, Latter-day Saints started to realize that the Book of Mormon describes a much smaller area and that it could only have happened in a smaller place. So before they thought it happened everywhere, they had limited time, limited tools. Later, we started realizing it happened in a smaller area. And that's when you get a bunch of geography models popping up here. And you can't blame them for being wrong because they didn't have the time and tools. Also, it's not core solid doctrine. It's okay for them to hypothesize. It's okay for them to see evidences and use it to support their theories, their ideas back then. They were generally right about the Book of Mormon being true, and they were just grabbing things around them. Now, it is interesting. This is something I think Mesoamericanists can say is, while we can't point to statements supporting our theories, we can see a progression where the church started realizing that a civilization was needed to support the Book of Mormon and started seeing it in Mesoamerica. But anyways, a lot of times people have issues with the Book of Mormon happening in a smaller spot. I once did a survey and found out that most members generally think this idea of it happening all over the Americas, and that's fine because most members don't really go in depth into it. They're focused on family and friends and personal things. Book of Mormon geography is not necessary to our salvation. But this quote here by Elder Oaks, when he was an apostle, kind of it helps support this idea of a smaller area. He once said, here at BYU in the 1950s, when he was a student, I was introduced to the idea that the Book of Mormon is not a history of all of the people who have lived on the continent of North and South America in all ages of the earth. Up to that point, I had assumed that it was. So here you have President Oaks, apostle back then, prophet now, realizing that the Book of Mormon happened in a smaller area. That's an entire video for another time. It's actually kind of fascinating. Now, how do we explain the prophet when he makes statements everywhere? Well, we could possibly say that he also had this hemispheric idea of the Book of Mormon happening all around him. Or we could possibly say that one of these is true and Jesus visited one of these people, but he also visited every tribe around in the Americas. I think that happened when Christ visited the peoples in the Book of Mormon. That wasn't until a year after his death. So he could have been visiting people in the Americas before that and after that. So that's how you can make sense of these statements, but I'm sharing it just to show that a Heartland model doesn't have, claim to every statement out there. Okay, so I hope this video helped out with understanding prophets and geography statements. We can't cherry pick any of these statements because there's so many everywhere, and it makes more sense when you understand doctrine and this idea of a wide promised land instead of a small promised land. And so it's just kind of futile to cherry pick statements. And that's why it's better on your list of criteria when trying to figure out Book of Mormon geography is to put certain things first. I put civilization first. Most scholars put civilization first. Do we have a civilization that matches the Book of Mormon? Next is geography. Do we have a geography that matches the Book of Mormon? And you go through things like that. But church history statements that help prove your patriotism don't end up working and can be dangerous. And then later on, if people grow up with that idea and then find out other stuff like this, that could possibly hurt testimonies if we're being too dogmatic about this. So anyways, I do a lot of geography stuff on this channel. I do a lot of Native American and Latter-day Saint issues and stuff on this channel. So please subscribe if you want more of that. And you can check out some of these videos here to learn more. Thanks for watching.